Hello and welcome to another episode of Metpro Insights, a show dedicated to cable management and the construction industry. Today's topic is all around carbon neutral, and we have the great pleasure of welcoming our very first external guest onto the show, Mr. Lee Jackson. How are you, Lee?
I'm good. Good, Jake.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks for joining us. Lee, before we start getting into the subject matter in earnest, could you just give us a bit of a background on who you are, what you do, and in essence, why people can trust you to talk about this?
I work for a business called Smart Carbon. We are a carbon emissions reporting consultancy. I've been with the business for just under 2 years now. But my background has largely been in finance and aviation, actually, for the best part of 30 years in commercial roles. And then about 5 years ago, I undertook some training through Northumbria University around environmental management and carbon reporting. And then as kind of it came out of the pandemic, an opportunity came up with Smart Carbon, and so I've been doing this now for 2 years, following that learning. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. I mean, it's interesting because I actually didn't know that. So you were in finance before. So what led to the transition?
If I look back at three generations, my great grandfather was a coal miner, my father was a dairy farmer, and I milked cows when I was 16, and then I went into financing. Well, started off in aviation and then ended up in a business that was financing travel. So there you go, three generations of people earning a living, but undertaking activity that was each of them relatively carbon intensive. And my father told me a story of my late father a few years ago before Christmas, where he explained that on Christmas Day, he actually went out and shot a rabbit and a pigeon, which they then had for Christmas dinner. This was when he was 17, and there was I, one generation apart. And I remember going to my local supermarket, as you do on Christmas Eve, and looking at all the consumption and thinking to myself, how can this work? How can this be possible? But interestingly, Jake, it then took several years. I didn't connect the dots. I saw that, but I didn't connect the dots. And there was I flying all over the world, funding people to fly all over the world, and then moment of realization just a few years ago, where I kind of started to find out what was happening in terms of carbon and greenhouse gases, and that fueled my interest and fueled the desire to want to do something, I suppose, helpful in that regard.
Yeah. So it's quite a personal journey then, this.
Oh yeah, it's a very it was a very personal journey, but I feel like in stepping into it now, I'm working with the business community with Smart Carbon, and then I've worked locally in Cumbria to with village and regional initiatives.
Right. Okay. Okay. Well, if we get into the real meat of the topic then, which is carbon neutral, more specifically within the construction industry, and for the tens of people we hope listening, just for context, really, Metpro is, as a business, we're on our own carbon neutral journey, understanding the impact that we're having as a business, and then looking to play our part as part of the global agenda, really, to really get this down and not lead to catastrophic scenarios that you might see in a Roland Emmerich film or something like that. And obviously, as you know, Lee, we've been working with yourselves over at Smart Carbon, and we're now at the point where we've got 3 years of carbon data, and certainly the plan for us now is to start offsetting as many aspects of that as we possibly can, and get into that carbon neutral stage. So the construction industry then, people might not know just how impactful it is, but I would hazard a guess that most people know it's quite a big contributor. What impact does the construction industry have on the global and UK footprints, carbon footprints?
So globally, construction is responsible for about 14 gigatons of emissions, and putting that in context, we are at the moment around 55 gigatons a year.
Wow.
Um, that's putting that in further context, we're working to a budget of 360 now. That's an absolute finite budget for all time of 360, and we're on 50. That's our challenge, that's why we have less than a decade now, because we've only got 360 for all time. So 14 of 55 from and that, within the UK, then 14% of our emissions are from construction and manufacturing activity, of which construction is like, globally, construction is about 11%. So it's likely to be the same here in the UK, and these numbers differ by a few percent depending which kind of data split you're reading, but it's of that magnitude. And then within that, we know that cement and that cement process is about 3% of global emissions, and 73% of emissions are down to energy use. So when we talk about construction, and we talk about the construction impact, like many industries, what we're actually talking about is the use of energy in
Right.
construction. That's where the impact comes from. It's the use of energy. It's the way that we're powering that activity that ultimately is driving the emissions. And clearly, with the heavy plant machinery that's used in construction, and then the use of materials such as cement and steel, then this is a relatively difficult sector to decarbonize. But with 14 gigatons of 55, it's one we absolutely have to address.
Yeah, and I think that I think the construction industry is absolutely well aware of it. I mean, in the build up to this
Yeah.
conversation, I've been doing my own research, and quite an encouraging piece that I came across was from the Construction Leadership Council, who, following the revelations of COP26, they seem to have created a number of different task forces. One specifically on concrete, as you mentioned a few minutes ago, because that's the. I mean, I will link this for anybody listening below, so you can go and have a look at this roadmap to the 2050 being net zero. But as there's a quote here from Chris Newsom, who's a founding member of the Green Construction Board, who says, concrete is the most ubiquitous of construction materials. In the UK, it accounts for approximately 1.2% of greenhouse gas emissions, although globally the cement production GHG emissions associated with concrete utilisation could be as high as 4 to 5%. So it's not an insignificant thing at all. And then moving on then to the actual buildings themselves, what I've seen is that I don't know if people think that it's just in the construction of the building itself, and then once it's there, it's problem solved. It's you've got all this carbon sitting within the materials themselves and the daily usage. So, is there are the government? I mean, should we even put the onus on the government here? But are they doing anything in relation to to the construction industry? Have they got any plans? Are they bringing in legislation?
Well, you want to try and keep politics out of these conversations, and it's increasingly
Yes.
difficult. But I suppose one of the things that is happening, and we're working with the construction sector, and we're working with a lot of construction businesses, as you know, Jake, and
Hmm.
so I think one of the things that is happening that is helpful, coming out of government, is that through their kind of recent procurement notice, one of the things that we do see now is that the that certainly here in the UK, that procurement notice back in September is now driving construction businesses to both report their emissions, to have but also more importantly to have a carbon reduction plan that's in line with the government's net zero plan.
Yes.
Now, we could get into those global emissions, and each individual jurisdiction, have got I'd argue a much more important interim target, which is for the end of this decade, and we've got to cut emissions according to the IPCC globally by 43%. That's by 2030. So that interim target becomes a real big one. However, what is coming out of that from that procurement, those procurement regulations, is that's now driving construction businesses to respond to that. In order to be accepted within a tender process, then you've got to have that carbon reduction plan, and importantly, that carbon reduction plan includes 5 Scope 3 subcategories. So it includes travel, includes waste, and it includes upstream and downstream transportation and distribution as well. And so in organisations and construction organisations having to have that in place, and have a net zero target in place, that net zero target includes also your supply chain. So what we're seeing here as a result of that, and this is where it's being effective, is that those tentacles are now starting to reach out through the private sector into organisations, and therefore it is actually bringing more and more organisations, construction organisations, into play. And we're seeing, from the large publicly listed organisations who were reporting Scope 1 and 2 anyway for a number of years, this is now starting to really flow out into all those subcontractors who are now starting to have to report. So that's the positive. That's good. Alongside that, you've got developments such as, we're hearing a lot now in the northeast about local hydrogen projects, and so there are efforts from if you like, in terms of product innovation, because I think the construction sector is a sector where we clearly need product innovation in order to meet those targets, and so there are efforts happening there. However, one in the Committee for Climate Change's last response to Parliament, one of the areas that they call out is building and manufacturing, and they they show on their model where we are in terms of having adequate plans and being on track. And so, whereas with energy and travel, the decarbonisation of the grid, there are good plans in place. Probably need more, but generally good progress in those two areas. But in building and manufacturing, that's where they show there's a big percentage of that activity and those emissions that we need to lose that at the moment have, according to the Committee for Climate Change, inadequate plans or no plans for some of that. So it is an area where much more progress needs to be made. And I suppose one of those areas called out by the Royal Institute of British Architects last year, where they were really clear on the fact that we need to do much more in terms of use of existing buildings. They made a point. We demolish 50,000 buildings a year, and the emissions, the emissions that come from that activity clearly are emissions that we need to address, and that we should be doing much more with existing infrastructure. But there's been lots of there's lots of dialogue and on that front with insulation. That's an obvious one. The insulation of existing properties. If you live somewhere like I do in Cumbria, there's lots of old buildings, and we know that that would be really helpful. But maybe there are lots of larger ex-industrial buildings where hitherto it seemed to make sense to knock them down and build something else because it's been economically more viable to do that. But the REBA have been very clear on that should be part of the overall strategy for construction.
Right. Wow. Okay. 50,000 buildings a year. Did you
Yeah,
say?
that's what I thought when I read it. Yeah, yeah,
Wow.
um,
That's incredible.
yeah. And again, this is a, when you come back to cement's an issue. Whether it's 3, whether it's 4, whether it's 5%, it's an issue. 73% is energy. So you've got the energy involved in pulling the thing down, the energy involved in the creation of the new materials, the energy involved in the construction, or the transportation of all that. It's reasonably obvious.
Yeah. Absolutely. Wow. I'm quite shocked by that. I really am. It's kind of,
Yeah,
yeah, left me a
yeah.
bit speechless
I
there.
was, yeah. When you read something like that, about demolition, it literally knocked me over.
Yeah. No pun intended.
Yeah.
Wow. So earlier on, you mentioned scope three, and just because some people listening may not be that familiar, they might be at the start of their own journey. I wondered if you could just give a very quick overview of the scopes and how many there
Yeah.
are and what they
Yeah.
mean.
Okay. So so there's 3 scopes, and the greenhouse gas protocol. When they define the measurement of a carbon footprint, they talk about the emissions that you are both directly responsible for and indirectly responsible for. If we're measuring it as an organisation, then it's what is your organisation responsible for, both direct and indirect. The direct emissions, I always explain this as if you imagine in order for the emissions to come out, generally, if you think of a building, then you'd see, in the worst case, there'll be a chimney, and you'll literally be able to see the emissions coming out of your building. And then if you extend that to a tailpipe, if you've got a vehicle, then you'll have an exhaust, and you'll see the emissions coming out of the exhaust. If you're using gas, then there'll be a flume on the back of the building. And so generally, in terms of scope 1, it's the emissions that literally take place through that asset in your organization, and the emissions are created through that. Scope 2 is indirect, but it's the emissions happen indirectly because this is basically energy whereby you're directly responsible for the energy use, but actually the emissions happen at the point of energy creation, and basically this is largely electricity, and therefore the emissions happen at the point of the power station. And so that is scope 2. So scope 1, you're creating those emissions, generally gas, petrol usage from your vehicles. Scope 2, electricity. And then scope 3 is everything else. And a good example is travel, business travel. So if you imagine I could create a consultancy. Here I am in this room. I could have solar panels on my roof, and I could largely, in terms of my direct emissions, have that nailed down to almost zero. I could then employ 50 people flying all over the world, and then somehow I pretend that my business is the footprint of my business is next to nothing. But the reality is, I've created this business. It's my business activities that are then commanding the use of of a seat from Richard Branson or British Airways or whoever, and then I expect them to, within their scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, to which they do, they take responsibility scope 1 and 2. But the reality is, in measuring my activity and being accountable for the activity of my business, it's me and it's my business that's driving the use for that airline seat. And that's
Yeah.
what scope 3 is about, really, because scope 3 truly enables you to show what the footprint of your activities are. And we are challenged quite a lot, especially because people are used to fiscal accounting, and say, well, aren't we double counting here? Well, there will be some element of that, but with what we're talking about, emissions don't mind. The carbon doesn't mind where it's coming from. The reality is, if we want to account for what we do, and that's what we have to do, then we have to look at everything that we do and whether we are driving emissions from somewhere else in the chain through what we're
Absolutely.
doing.
I mean, scope. We've reported on it as quite a good chunk of elements within scope 3, and naturally as a manufacturer with facilities overseas, and we're bringing things over on the water and then by road. The scope 3 emissions are by far the largest chunk. What really surprised me actually was just how much more of an impact road transportation has versus sea. That was incredible. Is it
Yeah,
4 times or something like that?
yeah,
It
yeah,
was just astonishing.
yeah.
So
But one of the because of course marine transport is a is a large emitter, and again that's going to be difficult to decarbonize as well. But one thing that is known is that if you slow it down, you can massively impact the emissions by slowing down the journey
yeah,
with sea transport, and so yeah. Um, but I,
okay,
I remember doing that with you, and it's quite interesting because if you could, I suppose if you could bring that to a port close to where your warehouses are, then you can reduce the emissions than taking it to the end of the country and then having to ship it up by by heavy goods vehicles.
absolutely. I think
Yeah,
my managing director thought that I was on some kind of drugs or something when I report, because he was just, how is that even possible? But yeah, a quick explanation that blew both of
yeah,
our minds. It's really quite incredible.
yeah.
Um, just going back to when you were talking about you're seeing now, there's quite a few more manufacturers, people within the construction industry starting their carbon neutral reporting. Do you still feel that there's, if there ever was, any significant resistance to it, or is it more that it's kind of a, because this isn't legislative, is it? There's no legal obligation on people, far as I understand it, to do this.
So from a UK legislative point of view, if you fall into the streamlined energy and carbon reporting regulations, which basically means you've got turnover of more than it's 35 million, or a balance sheet beyond 18, or more than 250 employees. If you're of that scale, two of those thresholds, then you are then you're legally obliged to report. But beyond that, to your point, Jake, people are volunteering to do this.
Good.
But then you've got these market drivers. So, well, I might not have to. I may not have to um, report to meet the legislature. But actually, if I want to put in a proposal for this piece of business of more than £5 million, then I'm going to have to report, because if I don't, and I don't have a carbon reduction plan, then I can't pitch for this piece of business. So you've got these market drivers that are happening now, and
Yeah.
then within those market drivers, you've also got um, the fact that so many stakeholders are looking at this, and those stakeholders might be employees in your business, might be your customers, and they're asking the question, well, are they reporting? What are they doing, and how carbon intensive is that business that I'm working with? So
Mm.
you've got all those dynamics now that are helpful, and so we've got both, I suppose, both market and regulatory and legislative um, dynamics that are influencing whether people report or not.
Okay. And what's the reality of the situation if businesses hold off? I know that there's the drivers that you just mentioned. I think that's quite a. It's a massive thing actually, because the reality is, if you can't put your business forward because you don't meet the requirements of a tender, well then you're
Yeah,
out of luck completely.
yeah.
But what is the reality if businesses decide not to do this?
Well, there's the obvious one that you've just said, is that that there are areas of business that you're not going to be able to compete for,
Yeah.
and that it's easy to underestimate actually what that looks like, because I was quite surprised with how we had some sizable businesses that I knew from my previous life who appeared relatively short notice and said, "Oh, we need to have a plan in place, and we've got to have it done in the next 4 to 6 weeks." And we find somewhere between 3 to 6 months people taking to undertake this exercise. So it doesn't have to be that long, but typically that's what amount of time that people would elapse in people completing a full baseline report. And so they were having to respond really quickly because actually, if we don't do this, we're not going to be able to put forward this tender response.
Yeah.
And so, you know, allowing yourself to fall behind on this as a business is not a good idea. And both from, if you can see how, and in manufacturing and construction, you can see how the lines on this will be relatively clear to see.
Mm.
However, it is happening so quickly now that it's easy to see how all of a sudden an organization could find out that there's a piece of business that they want to respond to, and the client has decided, for good reason, that part of the criteria will be that organization's could suddenly find that they're not able to respond to that business opportunity because the client has included this requirement within the tender process. But I think it should also be remembered that putting the tender process aside as well, customers increasingly, the general public and society now wants to see this, and therefore it is reflective of your organization, and therefore from a marketeer's perspective, the marketeers want something to play with in terms of what are we doing as an organization, because we need to be able to talk about this, and
Absolutely.
we need to be able to talk about this properly, so because one of the areas that we see is that as soon as an organization makes a claim, you've got to be able to stand by it, because this is one whereby people are really keen to see that what you say is in actual fact.
Yes. Yeah.
You will very quickly be hauled over the coals the more ambitious you claim to be.
Maybe that's quite an appropriate punishment when we
Sorry,
consider. Maybe that's quite an appropriate punishment when we consider what we're
hauled
discussing.
over the coals, yeah,
Yeah.
hauled over the carbon, yeah, yeah. So there's huge incentive for businesses, and I suppose you've only got to look at initiatives like the Science Based Targets Initiative and the UK's SME Climate Hub and those things, and on those initiatives, on their through the online presence, you can very quickly look at all the organisations, what they're doing, what their commitments are, what their net zero timeframe is,
Mm.
and that's building and building through the UN Race to Zero. And so with that, you can see the level of momentum that's going on, Jake, and from that, it's pretty clear that sometimes we'll say, well, we want to. I'll get a call from, might be a commercial area of the business, and say, well, we want to be ahead of the curve on this. Well, being ahead of the curve is long gone, but you can step up now before you're going to be a real laggard.
Absolutely. It's one of those things, isn't it, where it's, even if you've, for whatever reasons, you haven't gotten around to doing this, and I'm talking from a position of, not a position of, strength, but we're in exactly the same position. We only started doing this, working with you, in January this year.
Yeah.
And we're at the point where we're at now. So we're slightly over the 3 to 6 months. But we've got there. But if someone's thinking about starting today, then just, I guess, start today.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
Because it quite will be too late one day, I suppose.
yeah, yeah. Well, yeah.
It actually brings me on to my next question, really, Leah. I mean, obviously there's the financial implications to a business. not to do this, it could impact their ability to quite literally trade. What about the global environmental impacts to businesses not signing up? What are we looking at? What's the time frame really for all this stuff?
Um,
Big
yeah.
question.
So, the impact of business not signing up to this and doing what they need to do, and the impact of communities and society at large not signing up to this. I think I mentioned earlier that we talk about 2050, and we talk about many people will say that 2050 is not soon enough, and you've got things like you've got the pledge initiative which came out of Amazon, and that's 10 years early, so that's by 2040, and you've got many businesses who are well in advance of 2050 in terms of their ambition. But the reality is, when you look at the IPCC last report, and of course their warnings of, how do you get more urgent than code red, than now or never? I don't know what they're going to have to come up with next, and it's not even time, Jake, for a next. But they're really clear. We've got to cut our emissions by 43% by 2030.
Right.
Now, we've not managed to cut anything yet. I think the emissions went down by something like 6 or 7% in the global pandemic, but we got to cut by 55%. 43%. I'm thinking 55 gigatons here, but by 43% by 2030, and that's the number that we should all have in our minds, because if we don't manage to do that, then even that gives us basically 2/3 chance of retaining the warming at 1.5. And
Right.
we've all seen this year what the warming looks like globally at 1.2. Of course, here we're in the northern hemisphere, and I'm looking at dead fish on the lake through the algal bloom, and we're looking at parched land in the south of the UK, and fires from that as a result of 1.2 degrees of warming. But compared to the likes of Pakistan, and even in Mediterranean Europe, the extent of fires that they've seen, that's at 1.2. We're talking about retaining the warming or stopping it at 1.5. 1.5 is already going to be incredibly troublesome, and we've got to adapt in order to cope with that. We really can't afford to go beyond 1.5, and that's what all this is about. And if we want to give ourselves the best chance of limiting that warming to 1.5, then these emissions targets have to be sacrosanct.
Yeah, it's quite a humbling picture you've painted there. And I'm talking personally here. This is an absolutely personal opinion, but it's obviously, businesses need to, you need to make money to survive and trade. That's the fundamental of any business. But if you can get people emotionally invested in this as well, then something tells me that you're going to have a greater impact, because people will feel, when people realize they've got this responsibility, as I certainly think it's every individual's responsibility, it's not just business, then people will, you start to do things in your own life as well, and make that, and it's all, when people say certain things, whatever it is, they might say, I'm just one person, I can't change it. But if everybody thinks like that, then obviously nothing changes, does it?
No.
But if everybody just did something, then the impact would be quite incredible.
Yeah.
And I suppose that, that coming away from business now and talking as a pure individual, what can people do? Like, what are some real quick wins for people? Little examples you can give to people out there. This is what you can do now.
Well, I'll give this as the first thing is, I don't want to discourage recycling, but recycling is, remembering that 73% of this is energy use.
Hmm.
The only way you recycle anything is by using a load of energy to turn it from one thing into another. So it's it's good because you don't want to throw it away, but it's important to understand this is not about recycling. It's about energy. So I always use this as a good example. If you take, we are part, Jake, of maybe, I don't know, one, two, three at the most generations of human beings, and even then, that's in our part of the world, that have had to have in place some kind of separate exercise regime to burn up the energy that we're not using.
Mm.
For most generations of human beings, the energy that we've had within our bodies, we've had to use to work and do stuff and travel and create stuff, and then we've had the benefits of fossil fuels, so we've been able to drive. We've not had to walk and run and those things. And so I think that's a good example of, are there activities that you undertake using your car and that are quite carbon intensive, that you could replace with exercise? And a classic example is, if you've got a if you've got a cycle you use for exercise, and then you've got a car that you use to go and do the shopping, then pull the things two. That's a good example. Pull the two together. Maybe do regular shops, smaller shops, local shops, and pull it all together. And we have to eliminate as much as possible that carbon intensive activity. And for me, that's got, I've met a few people now. The other one you can do is, if you're part of a community group.
Mm.
Community groups are a great way to get this thing moving. We started a group here in the village that I'm in Cumbria, and I've been astonished what the response has been. Instantly we got 10% of the community here that came along to the meetings,
Oh,
and
brilliant.
the amount and all these things are now being tabled,
Yeah.
and people's willingness to consider what they can do. And as you said, it's humbling. Everybody, we got everybody to say why they were there, and most people that were there, Jake, were there because they've got kids or grandkids,
Yeah.
and they now see more and more clearly what's in store for their kids and grandkids, and therefore they want to do something. They want to just feel that they can do something. And these are relatively small changes that you can make,
Mm.
but we've got to make, when we say small changes, they've got to be small changes that are big in impact. And if if you cut back your car use, by half, that as a that would, I mean, imagine if we did that across the UK. That would
Yeah.
be enormous. These are carbon intensive activities that we can really cut back on, and that's what people are looking to do. People are looking at car sharing schemes and all kinds of things here. So, but I use that exercise piece as an example, because it could be reasonably small, but it's an adjustment in your kind of in your weekly lifestyle activity, that you
Yeah.
make that adjustment, and you say, well, I tend to try and if I run 20 miles a week. I don't, by the way, but if I did, then instead of that being completely separate to what else I do,
Mm.
maybe I'd run to the local town with some
Yeah.
small rucksack with my shopping bags in. I run to the local town. I've got my run in. I do my shopping, and I come back on the bus. And okay, that's troublesome, but it's an adjustment that would have a meaningful impact.
Okay. Okay. Great. I'm going to ask you a question now that I didn't send over.
Okay,
But
great.
after everything we've been talking about for the past half an hour, 40 minutes or so, what's your personal feeling about the future in relation to carbon emissions and climate change?
Uh,
Is it a positive picture, or is it not
Depends
sure?
what day you ask me that. I mean,
Okay.
I'll be really candid in saying that there are moments when this, and I think lots of people who've been on this kind of environmental journey, and actually our our MD has been 20 years in this, and I think people, long-standing environmentalists, have some real moments now, as do the climate scientists. So some days, but my overriding feeling is that this now has to become, um, this provides real purpose, and therefore, if you maintain that purpose, then you can have moments that can be really uplifting. That and as part of that, I think through the day job, when I look at the amount of initiatives that are happening, and I see the extent to which people are embracing this, and that's really really positive. And ultimately, we have no choice, Jay. We have to come together, and we have to do this. And whether we're successful or not, many people in business, they go into it being brave enough to make their business happen. And most entrepreneurs have a relative a willingness to try and make something happen, and they don't let failure get in the way. And
Yeah.
so therefore that's how we have to look at this. That is how we can't focus on that it might not happen. We have to give it everything now, because it's what is to lose is something that we can't contemplate, and therefore we purely have to focus on the job in hand, as most entrepreneurs do when they start businesses. That's how to look at it. And on most good days, that's how I look at it.
Okay. Okay.
Not
Good.
not dwell on the other days.
Yes, absolutely. Okay. Fair enough. Well, you mentioned your MD, Annalisa Mills, as you've mentioned to me before, lifetime environmentalist, and she's been aware of this for at least 2 decades now. We've been working with you guys since January. What are the benefits of working with Smart Carbon specifically?
So we're relatively long-standing, and Annalisa's 20 years in environmentalist, but 9 years of Smart Carbon, which makes us relatively long-standing in this space. So we're a carbon emissions reporting consultancy, and that's at the core of what we do. We know carbon reporting inside out. We run an advanced greenhouse gas accounting course through Northumbria University, and we're a mission-led business, Jay, and so the benefit that businesses get of working with us is that, as I hope you've witnessed, we see our calling to help organisations do this properly, to have confidence in that reporting and reduction planning exercise, and we hold the hands of businesses stepping into it, but we do so for this initial reporting exercise. We really, that's why we run courses, because our role really is to ensure that businesses are sufficiently equipped to know what they're doing. Our software enables them to then carry on doing it themselves, but that's exactly what I think the benefit of working with Smart Carbon is, that we enable you to do this. We enable you to do this on your own, not
Yeah.
not to need us forever to help you do it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like I said a couple of times, we've been working with you for a while, and I could personally attest to that, having been the one who's been inputting the data using the portal. And all I can say about the best thing I can say about the Smart Carbon team is you're just incredibly helpful. You're always there, and I certainly now feel confident enough to go away, report on 2022, and and get you guys to help me out as I need it. And just speaking about Metpro, again, at the start I mentioned we've got 3 years worth of data now. We're now starting work on our carbon reduction plan, and we're meeting with the somebody from the Forest Carbon Commission, or the Forest
Okay,
Carbon Trust.
yeah.
That discussion's happening, in fact, tomorrow, I think.
Brilliant.
So we're looking at what we can do there, what options are available to us. So yeah, for anybody listening, we can't recommend Smart Carbon enough.
Thanks, Jay. And equally, I think your commitment to this project, although you say well it's taken this time, but when you consider the initial task of all the data collation and in fairness, we've had you've had most of this wrapped up probably a couple of months ago. In fairness, so I think you've gone into this with some gusto and some realism and done a good job. And we can see that you're very well placed now to be able to get on and do this year in year out. And
yeah. Absolutely. I mean, when I say we're a bit over the threshold, to be honest with you, I'm just channeling upper management, because this is just that's all that they'll say to me, to be honest. So this is a nice little this is what the whole episode's about, is just endorsing me and the work that I do. Of course, I'm joking. I'm absolutely joking. But Lee, I've just got one more question to ask you, just to wrap things up, and it's I think I know what the answer's already going to be, but what do you think is the most important consideration UK businesses within the construction industry should have today?
Most important consideration?
Yeah, what's the thing that any business within the construction industry should be focusing on above all else?
Well, carbon is the currency of the 21st century. And you could also say energy is the currency of the 21st century. As we're seeing, and therefore making sure that carbon is managed is ultimately going to impact your ability to transact as a business.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, Lee, it's been an absolute pleasure. I think we've covered quite a significant amount there. Some incredible stats. Still can't get over that 50,000 buildings being knocked down. If anybody wants to reach out and start their journey with Smart Carbon, where can they find you?
So I'm at so Lee Jackson is at l.jackson@smartcarboncalculator.com.
Brilliant, and we'll put a link to the to the Smart Carbon website below. As always, anybody listening, Metpro, you can find us on LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram, and connect with any of the team through LinkedIn as well if you want to ask us any questions. And yeah, Lee, once again, thank you very much. It's been great. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Catch you soon. Bye.